One of the things that the older I've become, really just love and appreciate botanical gardens. Some of you have seen me just riding around town, and I'll either on my way home, I'll take this long, just meandering way from St. Paul out to the north side of Columbus where we live. Just driving through different neighborhoods, looking at people's gardens that they might have, or a well-developed flower bed to me is beautiful. I love the colors. Often I'll take pictures. I've got to be careful with this. So if you're watching and you see me riding around, I'm taking pictures. I'm just taking pictures of your garden, okay? But I have to give you this disclaimer. My appreciation for just beautiful landscape yards with just wonderful flower beds, it doesn't always equal application in my yard, or much less around my house. I would love to be able to tell you that I've got this wonderful green thumb and that people call me to talk about their flowers. The truth is, it's probably more black than it is green. I have killed all types of plants. Right now, inside of our yard, there are 3 that are resisting me. My lantanas, they're still living, and my lilies, they're still living as well, and my knockout roses. Now, I've done my best to kill them, but in spite of my efforts, they're still blooming, and everything seems to be going fairly well. But everything else that I've planted, either this year or in previous years, they're true to form. They're dying, and so I went and spent some time yesterday refilling my flower beds, and hope that just for a couple more months it'll still look pretty around our house. But I'm convinced that the first frost will not kill our plants and our flowers. I will be good over the next couple of weeks. I've also discovered a couple things too about gardens. I really detest and hate weeds. I really do. And just overnight, they can infiltrate my gardens and probably your garden. They are the cockroaches of the plant kingdom, I promise you. Cannot stand weeds. And or just the way the grass and the weeds, it just sort of will just creep on and on and on, closer and closer, and before long it starts to infiltrate your flower beds, and you have to keep your guard up all the time. I mean, if you take a couple of days off, just overnight it seems weeds everywhere. I've discovered that that's not just a problem for flower beds. Weeds were actually a huge problem in the ancient world. I don't know if you knew that or not. Now, it might not be the weeds the way we know them, but there were all types of weeds that would infiltrate the ancient world. For instance, in our text, Paul plants a church, and everything's going well for about a year, maybe a year and a half. Paul leaves, and he moves on to plant another church. And then, little by little, these weeds start to infiltrate the surrounding Corinthian church. Now, they're not weeds like what we know, but they sort of manifested themselves as weeds that would be in strength or beauty or wealth or wisdom. Those things were in the surrounding culture, and it's not that those things themselves were bad. It's just that the surrounding culture of the ancient world would take strength or power or beauty or wealth or wisdom, and they would highlight them in such a way that they would step over other people to obtain them. They would often they even would kill others for it. They would pursue these things at all costs. That was the surrounding culture of the ancient world. And about the time Paul was leaving the church at Corinth, they started popping up inside the church. Now, if you know anything about the church at Corinth, that it thrived off these factions. And there were groups in the church that would seek power, and they would step on other people in order to get it. Or there were these groups in the church that would seek wisdom, and they would step over other people to obtain it. There were people in the church that lived off physical beauty, and anybody that didn't have a certain level of physical beauty, they would sort of cast this to the side. And there were people that would do the same thing with wealth. And they were like weeds in the church. And these different factions fought. I mean, you would think that even inside the church, that wouldn't be an issue, but it was. And so what we have for the Corinthian letters are actually where there were these groups. There was a group in the church that wrote a laundry list of Paul and said, Paul, can you help us? We have all these issues going on. Can you give us some insight? And what we have in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians are actually letters that he wrote back to the church dealing with these levels of weeds. For them, whenever they would either have wealth or beauty or power or wisdom, that it was, to use a modern day phrase, it was winning. And they would pursue this at all cost. Not just in the ancient world, but this idea of weeds, it's a problem even today. And the reason why it's a problem is because there are some things in the world that just can't be solved by strength or by beauty or by might or by wisdom. See, the Greeks thought that they could solve everything just by being wise. And so if they could apply logic or reason, or they could go and trace it back to some seat of philosophy, then somehow that would give them whatever they were needed to be able to solve all types of issues. But think about the things that show up in life that just can't be solved by wisdom, or solved by power, or by beauty, or by wealth. I mean, how can force, power, how does that, how can that eliminate the self-destroying habit of addictions? Or how can beauty, or wealth, or wisdom? What about things in our society where people feel trapped inside of their life? They feel trapped inside of depression. Or how about restoring a relationship? How much might is needed to restore a relationship? How much beauty? How much wealth? I mean, if we have those things, do we get a free pass? What about dysfunctions that show up inside of families or inside of relationships? Or what about the ills in society? I mean, how much power can solve, or how much beauty can solve what I call the isms? Racism? Sexism? I mean, tell me, how much wealth is needed for that? How much beauty is needed for that? How much wisdom is needed to solve those things? See, it's not just an issue that plagued the ancient world. It plagues us. It's a universal problem, because there's some things that can't be solved or fixed. That's a good Southern word, right? Fixed by this. This is what Paul is getting at in the text, because what Paul is talking about is that there are some things that just can't be solved by wisdom, can't be solved by might, can't be solved by beauty or by wealth. And he's talking about what God provides a remedy for these things, and he's reminding the church of this totally different concept that was completely foreign to the surrounding culture of his day, and it's foreign to the surrounding culture of our day. And he's talking about this logic that's based off the cross. And it's revelation. It's a new way of looking at things. It's like God, it's like we're living in a room where the light's off, and then God cuts on the light, and all of a sudden we're able to see things completely different. And that's this logic of the cross that Paul is talking about. He says for some people it manifests, it looks like weakness, it looks like foolishness. 5 times in the text, Paul mentions this word foolishness. It looks like foolishness. It's moronic. It looks like weakness. And yet, the moment you see it, the moment the light goes off, everything is redefined now through this type of revelation. The lights were turned on. And he said that the way that manifests itself inside the world is what he did in Jesus Christ. And somehow by experiencing this cross and this resurrection, that our whole beings, the whole way we look at the world is totally transformed. And it changes everything that we see. And even everything that we do. And so fulfillment and peace, life is seen not in terms of beauty, not in terms of wealth or wisdom or in power. You can find fulfillment in things that a simplistic lifestyle. You can find beauty not just in physical appearance, but in the authentic self, an authentic life. And power and might is not with muscle or strength. Its power is seen in submission. Wholeness is seen not in the acquiring of things, but in the giving of things. Jürgen Moltmann was a brilliant theologian, and he would often say that these people who now see this logic of the cross and where the lights have been turned on, he said what they become servants of joy. And it looks so foreign to the world around them. But it ends up fueling their entire life. This idea of servants of joy, I love that. That's who we are. We see life differently through experiencing Jesus Christ. Now, I think the people who experience Jesus Christ and they see things differently, the lights have been turned on, and they go about living their life this way, they become a witness to the surrounding culture that can be transformative for our world. I think this if you want to ask me how you change the world, this is how you change the world. People who've experienced this Jesus Christ and they live their life completely different than the surrounding culture. They're tied to this logic of the cross. They're tied to this logic of the resurrection. And they go about living their life not with the acquiring of things like beauty and wealth and wisdom and power. They live it now with this beat, with this heartbeat that's tied to Jesus Christ. And their life looks completely different. Now, some of you are reading The Great Divorce with me. What we'll actually look at here in a couple of minutes when this service is over with is when we find these people in chapter 1 and chapter 2, they see this bus driver. The Great Divorce, what that story's about is that these people, they're in the town of hell, and they're given a 3-day pass roughly to go into the town of heaven. And the way they get there in the very beginning is that they get on this bus, and the bus is coming from the town of heaven to pick up the people in the town of hell and take them to the outskirts of the city. And the people who are lined up, they see this bus driver, and he's glowing. And at first, it's almost offensive. It's just oozing out of him. That's this witness, just oozing out of him. You know, Jesus talked about this, not so much in the idea of taking a bus ride, but in Matthew chapter 5, he talks about this in what we call the Beatitudes. That these people who live their life tied to this new way of logic, this new way of looking at things. He says it looks like it's weakness. It looks like it's foolishness to everybody else. But there's a way of life that's tied to this Jesus that ends up being blessed. Blessed are the poor in spirit. for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, because they will be comforted. Blessed are those who are meek, because they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. They will find fulfillment. Blessed are those who are merciful, for they shall find mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they are the ones who see God. Blessed are the peacemaker, because they will be called the children of God. That's completely foreign to the culture around us. And yet the people who experience this Jesus, this becomes home cooking for them. This becomes their way of life. In the 2nd century, there was this philosopher, Roman philosopher, he wrote this letter to the emperor. And he was making all these these observations about the world around him. And he said there was this small group, this small sect, just small as in numbers. And they called themselves Christians. And he wrote a number of things about them, but one of the things he said to this emperor, he said, truly, they are a new people because there's something divine inside of them. And they live their life They live with this moral code that's tied to Christ. They live with this allegiance to Christ where they base their life on His teachings. And he says it's completely transforming to them and to the world around them. And he begins to write about who they are. He ends up actually becoming a Christian from observing these people. And he began to see that their life was tied completely different than the things of his culture in the world, that their life was tied to Jesus Christ. And that witness began to just spread all over the world. Same with us. There are all kind of things around us that are like weeds. And we can live our life that way. And we can spend all of our time and all of our energy pursuing those things. And at some point, we're going to discover that it's nothing more than foolishness. And yet we could find ourselves walking with Christ in such a way, experiencing this cross, experiencing this resurrection. And it's like the lights turn on inside of our lives. And we end up beating and walking with Him. And our life ends up being, well, like these Beatitudes. From the outside, it might look a little different. But on the inside, fulfillment. On the inside, a sense of, well, blessedness. To the point that we find wholeness, not in pursuing beauty, wealth, or power, or wisdom, but we find it in Him. That's been my prayer for us this entire week, that if you've never experienced this Jesus Christ, that you would open yourself up and just give Him a shot. Trust in Him. To fully lay our life before Him and say, God, this is all that I am. I'm not going to hold anything back. And if there's anything to what Paul is talking about, or if there's anything to these Beatitudes, or even what this 2nd century philosopher talked about, that there's this idea of a new people, and there's something divine inside of them, and they live their life differently. If there's anything to that, it really is going to be up to you. I'm tired of pursuing it this way. I'm tired of investing my life in all these different things that end up being like weeds. And so there's going to be something that develops out of this, God. It really is going to be up to you. Would you be willing to do that? Just open your life up to Him. And allow this God who can interact into our time and space to do it in such a way that brings wholeness. Would you do that now? It's real simple. Let's pray. Oh God, you talk about this this way of life. And often inside the church, we want to make it so convoluted. And we put so many different qualifiers and thresholds, and yet the pathway of walking with you is so simple. Lord, we confess. That's the first step. We confess that we've tried it a host of different ways. And it's like tinsel. It looks good for a moment. It's here today and it's gone tomorrow. And so we confess our need for you. And what we humbly ask, oh God, is that you would reveal yourself in such a way that changes how we think, which ends up changing how we live. And in a way that only you're able to do. That's what Paul's talking about in the text. Something that looks so out of line ends up being life. We give thanks for your grace and mercy, not just for forgiveness, but for wholeness. This idea of salvation it's not just for something in the future, tomorrow. It has everything to do with today. And so as we find trust in you, which is a process, little by little of giving more and more of our life, trusting you that if we really do let down our guards and if we put everything that we are inside of your hands, that you're going to hold that. And you're going to change it. This idea of patiently waiting, we sang that. Make it real for us, oh God. For the person who maybe for the very first time is wanting to venture out with you. Oh, have mercy, oh God. And then for the person who has walked with you for years and years and years, and yet they find themselves still just letting their guard down, and overnight it's weeds have showed up in a way that you're able to take every ounce of our life and make it whole. We want that desperately today. And then for those of us who carry burdens for other people, maybe family members, maybe coworkers, neighbors, friends, and we want so desperately, we see them fighting and struggling, where we spend so much time and energy after these weeds. Oh God, use us. You allow our life to be a witness. So that just in observing, not that there's anything wonderful about who we are or what we do, but what people see is that we're connected to this divine. And people see that. They see a way of life that causes people to want to join the ranks Oh God, we need you, we pray. And we ask it in the name of Christ. Amen.